Before the conflict announces itself, the world appears already decided. Order is visible, stable, almost generous. Power has a recognizable shape, bright, legible, easy to trust. The city stands intact, its skyline unbroken, its rhythms predictable. Above it all, figures move through the air like punctuation marks in a sentence that feels complete. Among them, one presence is newer, quieter, still learning how to occupy space without distorting it. Supergirl enters this world after its mythology has already been written. The symbols are in place long before she arrives. The rules of heroism have been rehearsed. Strength is celebrated when it reassures, when it mirrors what the world already believes about itself. The sky has accepted its guardians, and the ground has learned how to look up without fear. There is room for awe, but only of a certain kind. She does not come as a pioneer. She arrives as an echo. Her origin does not inaugurate a myth, it complicates one. Where others descend into this world carrying promise, she lands carrying memory. Not just of a lost planet, but of a life that once had gravity, hierarchy, and consequence. She remembers what came before the ruin. That memory does not translate easily into gratitude. From the outside, her presence reads as abundance. Another protector, another symbol of reassurance, another figure capable of lifting what cannot be lifted. The narrative welcomes her with open hands, but those hands are already shaped. They expect a certain posture in return, a smile that confirms safety, a performance of belonging that requires no negotiation. This is where the system quietly tightens. Supergirl is framed as a gift, but gifts carry obligations. Gratitude becomes the invisible currency of acceptance. Strength is permitted as long as it affirms the existing order, as long as it does not question the foundations it stands upon. The world does not ask her who she is. It asks what she will do for it. The atmosphere before the crisis is calm, but it is not neutral. It is weighted. The air holds an expectation that has not yet been spoken. She is stronger than almost anyone in the city, but she occupies a smaller space. Her power expands outward, yet her identity contracts inward, pressed by the unspoken agreement that she must be thankful to be here at all. The city becomes a stage where visibility is selective. Some figures are allowed to cast long shadows. Others are expected to remain illuminated at all times. Supergirl exists under a permanent spotlight, but it is not her own. It reflects an image of virtue that predates her. Any deviation from that image risks misunderstanding, then suspicion. Alienation does not announce itself through exclusion. It appears through inclusion with conditions. She is welcomed, but never unburdened. Her grief is acknowledged only in abstract. Her anger is tolerated only when it can be redirected into service. The weight she carries is reframed as proof of her resilience, not as a cost. The territory she occupies is unstable. Physically, she can cross borders with ease. Psychologically, she remains at the perimeter. There is no clear center she is allowed to claim. The foundation beneath her feet is borrowed, constructed by a narrative that belongs to someone else. She stands within an empire of meaning that did not ask for her input, only her compliance. Strength, in this context, becomes a pressure rather than a release. The more capable she is, the more responsibility accumulates. The more responsibility she carries, the less space she has to fail, to hesitate, to refuse. Her power attracts expectation like gravity. Every act of protection deepens the assumption that protection is her natural state. The world mistakes survival for consent. Because she endures, it assumes she agrees. Because she saves, it assumes she is fulfilled. Gratitude is inferred, not expressed. It becomes a moral demand embedded in every cheer, every headline, Every relieved breath after disaster is averted. This is the quiet contradiction at the heart of her presence. She is both indispensable and replaceable, celebrated and constrained, visible and unseen. Her strength places her above the city, but her story keeps her orbiting it, never landing, never fully departing. The conflict has not yet surfaced, but its outline is already visible in negative space. It exists in what she cannot say without consequence, in what she must absorb to remain accepted, in the unspoken rule that her pain must never outweigh the comfort she provides. This is not a story about rebellion yet. It is a story about load-bearing silence, about the cost of being strong in a world that treats strength as a public utility, about an identity formed not through choice, but through expectation. The stage is set. The city stands intact. The sky remains open. The symbols hold. But beneath the smooth surface, pressure accumulates. The system is stable only as long as she continues to carry what was never meant to be carried alone. The conflict waits. Supergirl's origin is not defined by arrival alone, but by displacement. She does not simply come from another world. She comes from a collapsed center. Krypton is not a lost home in the abstract sense. It is a vanished structure of meaning that once organized her identity. Unlike figures who arrive without memory, she carries continuity. She remembers language, hierarchy, family, and a way of being strong that was not yet performative. That memory becomes the first fracture between her and the world she enters. Her strength was never meant to be exceptional. On Krypton, power existed within a shared scale. Ability had context. It was regulated by culture, expectation, and consequence. Strength did not isolate, it integrated. When that structure collapses, the same strength becomes disproportionate. What was once ordinary turns into spectacle. What was once relational becomes symbolic. The new world does not understand this difference. It interprets her power through its own mythology, one already shaped by a singular figure who has come to represent moral gravity itself. Superman is not just another hero. He is the foundation stone of the symbolic city. His presence defines what goodness looks like when it is absolute, calm, and endlessly patient. He is the reference point against which all similar power is measured. Supergirl enters that orbit immediately. Her identity is framed relationally before it is allowed to stand on its own. She is not introduced as a survivor of a destroyed civilization. She is introduced as a variation, a younger echo, a secondary expression of an already accepted ideal. This framing is subtle but decisive. It determines how her actions are read, how her emotions are tolerated, and how her failures are judged. The contrast between them is not merely experiential, it is structural. Superman arrives as a blank surface upon which the world can project its hopes. He grows into the culture that adopts him. Supergirl arrives already formed, already carrying grief, already aware of what has been lost. She does not discover humanity gradually. She confronts it fully formed, with all its contradictions intact. This difference generates a silent tension at the foundation of her narrative. Gratitude is expected from her, but gratitude assumes benefit without equivalent loss. The world sees what it has gained, not what she has forfeited. Her displacement is treated as a necessary precondition for her heroism, not as a trauma that continues to exert force. Her ethics emerge from this gap. She is not guided by abstraction, but by memory. Justice for her is not an ideal floating above circumstance. It is anchored to lived consequence. She has seen what happens when systems fail completely. She understands collapse not as theory, but as history. This makes her responses sharper, less patient, more urgent. The culture she enters values restraint as maturity. Calm is equated with wisdom. Emotional distance is mistaken for moral clarity. Within this framework, Supergirl's intensity reads as instability. Her anger is not contextualized as grief transformed into vigilance. It is framed as excess. Something to be managed. Something to be softened. This is where alienation begins to take form. Not through rejection, but through correction. She is guided, advised, recalibrated. Her instincts are filtered through an external standard that does not originate in her experience. Over time, this produces a split between what she feels and what she is permitted to express. The burden of gratitude reinforces this split. Gratitude is positioned as a moral baseline rather than a personal emotion. She is expected to be thankful for safety, for acceptance, for purpose. Yet these offerings come embedded within a structure that limits her autonomy. To question the terms of belonging is to risk appearing ungrateful. Silence becomes the price of inclusion. Her strength intensifies this dynamic rather than resolving it. Because she can endure more, she is expected to endure silently. Because she can repair damage, she is asked to absorb it. Strength becomes a justification for further demand. The stronger she proves herself, the less room she is given to refuse. Narratively, this positions her at a contested boundary. She stands between worlds, between definitions of power, between modes of belonging. She is neither fully integrated nor fully autonomous. The city relies on her presence while subtly resisting her influence. She protects a territory that never fully becomes hers. This tension is mirrored in how antagonism forms around her. Conflicts are rarely framed as challenges to her power. They are framed as tests of her control. The question is never whether she can win, but whether she can restrain herself enough to be acceptable afterward. Victory alone is insufficient. It must be aesthetically pleasing, morally reassuring, free of residue. Each confrontation reinforces the same lesson. Power without emotional compliance is dangerous. Strength without gratitude is suspect. Over time, these lessons accumulate. They shape her self-perception, narrowing the space between who she is and who she is allowed to be. The psychological foundation of her story is built on this narrowing. Her internal world becomes crowded with unexpressed contradiction. She is asked to represent hope while privately negotiating loss. She is asked to embody optimism while carrying memory of extinction. This dissonance does not resolve itself. It deepens. Culturally, her narrative emerges at a moment when strength itself is under scrutiny. The figure of the invulnerable savior has begun to fracture. Audiences are increasingly aware of the cost of idealization, the violence hidden beneath reassurance. Supergirl becomes a site where these anxieties converge. She is powerful but not inviolable. She is moral but not detached. She exposes the strain required to sustain goodness within rigid expectations. The world she inhabits is not hostile, but it is inflexible. Its foundations were laid before her arrival. Its myths are already stabilized. There is limited tolerance for deviation, even when that deviation emerges from pain rather than ambition. Her presence threatens not through opposition, but through difference. This is the field in which the conflict will take shape, a system that depends on her strength while constraining her agency, a culture that celebrates resilience while denying rest, a narrative that demands gratitude without offering reciprocity. Nothing has broken yet. No decisive rupture has occurred, but the pressure is already structural. It exists in the space between memory and expectation, between survival and belonging, between strength as capacity and strength as obligation. The forces are in place. The fracture is inevitable. The first visible shift does not arrive as catastrophe. It arrives as repetition. Rescue follows rescue. Crisis follows crisis. Each event reinforces Supergirl's position as a stabilizing force within the city, yet each also deepens the imbalance between what she gives and what she is allowed to take. The narrative rhythm tightens. Her presence becomes predictable in function, even as her internal pressure grows less manageable. At this stage, conflict remains framed externally. Threats emerge from outside the city, from criminal structures, from alien incursions, from forces that test physical limits rather than moral ones. Supergirl meets them efficiently, decisively. Her victories are clean. The skyline remains intact. The system congratulates itself on its resilience. But beneath this surface order, something begins to drift. The city's reliance on her strength becomes habitual. Emergencies are routed toward her by default. Responsibility concentrates. Other figures recede slightly, not through absence, but through comparative stillness. Supergirl moves more often. She intervenes more quickly. She absorbs more consequence. This accumulation begins to alter perception, not just her own, but the world's. She is no longer merely capable, she is expected. The difference matters. Expectation introduces entitlement. Gratitude from the city quietly transforms into assumption. Her availability is treated as permanent. Her consent is presumed. Psychologically, this is the moment where strength starts to invert. What once functioned as agency becomes obligation. Choice erodes not through force, but through necessity. Saying no becomes morally complicated. Every refusal carries imagined collateral damage. The city does not coerce her, it depends on her. Dependence proves more binding than command. This is where alienation sharpens. She begins to sense that her role is less about who she is and more about maintaining continuity. She is a load-bearing structure within a symbolic architecture she did not design. Any instability in her threatens collapse elsewhere. The pressure becomes constant. The narrative responds by testing her limits indirectly. Antagonists emerge who provoke reaction rather than confrontation. They manipulate scale, timing, proximity. They force her to choose between saving many or saving one, between decisive force and controlled restraint. These are not tests of power, but of alignment with the system's values. Each choice carries residue. Saving the many reinforces her utility. Saving the one risks criticism. The city watches closely, even when it claims not to. Visibility intensifies. The spotlight narrows. Mistakes that would pass unnoticed for others linger longer around her. Her emotional responses begin to surface through action rather than speech. She moves faster, hits harder, interrupts earlier. These are not lapses in control, but expressions of urgency shaped by memory. She knows what total failure looks like. She has lived through absolute loss. The idea of hesitation carries existential weight for her. The system reads this differently. Urgency is interpreted as volatility. Intensity as instability. The narrative begins to frame her strength as something that requires supervision. Guidance becomes correction. Support becomes calibration. Her autonomy subtly contracts. This is the first stage of polarization, though it is not yet named as such. On one side stands Supergirl's lived reality, shaped by collapse, memory, and consequence. On the other stands the city's moral framework, optimized for continuity, reassurance, and symbolic cleanliness. Both claim to value protection. They disagree on cost. A critical moment arrives when her intervention produces unintended damage. Not catastrophe, but visible fracture. A building damaged. A public space disrupted. No lives lost. The city is safe. Yet the reaction is disproportionate. Questions surface. Commentary circulates. The narrative tone shifts from gratitude to assessment. This moment matters not because of what was lost, but because of what is revealed. Her strength is no longer perceived as purely benevolent. It is now framed as a force that must justify itself continuously. The trust she assumed was stable proves conditional. Internally, this registers as betrayal. Not dramatic, not explosive, but corrosive. She realizes that her acceptance is contingent on flawless performance. That the margin for error she thought existed was never actually there. The burden of gratitude intensifies. Now she must be thankful not only for belonging, but for tolerance. The city does not articulate this explicitly. It does not need to. The shift is atmospheric. She feels it in hesitation before deploying force, in second-guessing instinct, in the subtle recalibration of how others speak to her. The territory she occupies becomes more constrained. This movement ends not with rupture, but with recognition. Supergirl becomes aware, perhaps for the first time, that her strength places her in a paradoxical position. She is too powerful to be ignored, yet too emotionally complex to be trusted fully. The system needs her, but it does not know how to hold her without reshaping her. The conflict has taken form, not as opposition, but as misalignment. The pressure continues to build. The second movement begins when misalignment hardens into pattern. What was once an occasional recalibration becomes a constant background condition. Supergirl's actions are no longer evaluated solely by outcome, but by tone, restraint, and symbolic impact. The city's relationship to her strength shifts from reliance to management. Power is still needed, but it must now be carefully shaped, moderated, and publicly legible. This is the stage where supervision becomes visible. Not overtly authoritarian, but procedural. Briefings lengthen. Protocols multiply. Decisions that were once intuitive are now expected to pass through consensus. The system frames this as maturity, as evolution. From its perspective, this is responsible governance of force. From hers, it feels like compression. Her territory narrows without shrinking physically. She can still cross borders, lift structures, neutralize threats. But the range of acceptable expression contracts. Certain responses are discouraged. Certain instincts are flagged as excessive. The line between guidance and control blurs, not through malice, but through repetition. Psychologically, this produces a subtle inversion. Instead of asking what the situation requires, she begins to ask what will be approved. The center of gravity shifts outward. This is not obedience, but adaptation, a learned recalibration meant to preserve belonging. Over time, this adaptation accumulates strain. Antagonists begin to sense this shift. They exploit her visibility rather than her vulnerability. Conflicts are staged in public spaces. Cameras are present. Witnesses multiply. Every intervention becomes performance, whether she wants it or not. The battlefield moves from physical terrain to symbolic arena. In these encounters, restraint becomes a trap. If she acts decisively, she risks appearing excessive. If she hesitates, she risks failure. Either outcome feeds the same narrative of instability. The system demands precision under impossible conditions. The margin for error disappears. This is where polarization sharpens. Supergirl's internal compass, shaped by memory of collapse, prioritizes prevention at any cost. The city's moral compass, shaped by preservation of order, prioritizes appearance and continuity. Both claim ethical legitimacy. Neither yields. The emotional cost surfaces in fragments. A delay where there once was immediacy. A pause before impact. A moment of calculation that interrupts instinct. These are not signs of growth, but of fragmentation. Her strength begins to feel divided against itself. At the same time, public perception fractures. Some view her intensity as necessary honesty. Others interpret it as threat. Identification polarizes. She becomes a screen onto which collective anxiety is projected. The city no longer sees a protector alone. It sees a question. This question destabilizes the symbolic order. If strength carries grief, if power carries anger, if salvation is not gentle, then the myth that sustains the city becomes harder to maintain. Supergirl's presence exposes what the system prefers to conceal, that protection always involves force, and force always involves cost. Institutional response follows, not punishment but containment. Her role is clarified, her scope defined, her authority redistributed. This is presented as balance, as shared responsibility, yet the effect is unmistakable. She is being repositioned from central pillar to managed asset. Internally, this registers as erosion, not of power, but of coherence. The alignment between who she is and what she does weakens. Each decision now carries an echo of external judgment. Her internal world grows louder as her external freedom narrows. A critical rupture occurs when she defies expectation, not recklessly but decisively. A situation demands immediate action. Protocol would delay. She acts anyway. The outcome is successful. Lives are saved. The threat neutralized. Yet the response is mixed. This moment crystallizes the conflict. Effectiveness is no longer sufficient. Legitimacy now requires compliance. The city's reaction reveals that its anxiety is not about safety, but about control. About who decides when force is justified. Supergirl understands this instantly. The realization is not dramatic. It is clarifying. She sees that her strength has outgrown the narrative that contains it. That gratitude has become a leash. That belonging has been conditional all along. The polarization is now explicit. On one side, her lived ethic shaped by loss, urgency, and consequence. On the other, a system invested in stability, symbolism, and predictability. Neutrality is no longer possible. Every action affirms one position or the other. The movement ends with displacement, not exile but estrangement. She remains within the city, but no longer at its center. The territory she once defended now feels provisional. The sky above it feels heavier. The conflict advances. The fracture deepens. The third movement begins after clarity replaces confusion. Supergirl no longer wonders why the tension exists. She understands the architecture that produces it. This understanding does not bring relief. It brings weight. Awareness sharpens responsibility rather than dissolving it. She now acts knowing exactly what each decision will cost, not only in lives or damage, but in narrative consequence. The system responds to this awareness with quiet resistance. There is no open confrontation, no explicit removal. Instead, distance is introduced. Communication becomes formal. Trust becomes procedural. Her presence is acknowledged, but no longer central. She is allowed to operate, but not to define. This shift reconfigures the symbolic terrain. The city that once felt like an arena now feels like a boundary. She moves through it, above it, around it, but no longer within it. The territory she protects becomes something she circles rather than inhabits. The center recedes. Antagonists escalate accordingly. They no longer test her restraint alone. They test her isolation. They create scenarios where intervention requires endorsement she cannot obtain in time, where acting alone appears insubordinate, where waiting appears negligent. The structure forces her into visible contradiction. In these moments, Supergirl's strength reveals its final transformation. It is no longer simply capacity. It is exposure. Every action illuminates the fault lines of the system. Her presence becomes a diagnostic force, showing where authority fractures under pressure. She begins to operate at the edge of legitimacy. Still heroic, still protective, but increasingly unsanctioned. This is not rebellion born of resentment. It is fidelity to an internal ethic that can no longer be reconciled with external approval. Her actions follow necessity rather than permission. The cultural response intensifies. Media narratives polarize further. She is framed alternately as uncompromising guardian or uncontrollable force. Nuance collapses. The public discourse simplifies what it cannot integrate. Her complexity becomes liability. This simplification is not accidental. It serves the system. Reducing her to symbol allows the structure to avoid reckoning with what she exposes. The focus shifts from conditions to personality. From architecture to attitude, blame becomes portable. Psychologically, this marks a decisive shift. Supergirl no longer seeks alignment. She accepts misrecognition as structural rather than personal. This acceptance is not peace. It is resolve. The burden of gratitude falls away, not because it was never real, but because it no longer governs her decisions. Her strength stabilizes internally even as it destabilizes externally. The fragmentation introduced by constant calibration begins to heal, not through validation, but through coherence. She acts from a unified center again, even as that center exists outside institutional boundaries. The system interprets this coherence as threat, not because of what she does, but because of what she represents. A form of power that does not require endorsement. A morality that does not defer to consensus. A presence that cannot be fully absorbed. The final rupture of this movement is not violent. It is symbolic, a moment where she chooses withdrawal over compliance, not retreat, but repositioning. She steps beyond the immediate jurisdiction of the city's expectations. The sky opens not as escape, but as distance. This movement does not end with victory or defeat. It ends with separation. Supergirl remains a protector, but no longer a property. Her relationship to the world shifts from integration to orbit. She is close enough to intervene, far enough to remain intact. The conflict has reached its structural conclusion. The system stands. She stands apart. The consequences begin to ripple outward. Once the conflict detaches from the individual and begins to circulate, its meaning expands. Supergirl's story no longer belongs solely to her narrative arc. It becomes a cultural signal, a symbolic disturbance that moves through the larger ecosystem of heroism, power, and expectation. The question is no longer what she will do next, but what her position reveals about the structures that surround her. At this stage, the city functions less as a setting and more as a collective psyche. Its responses are patterned, repetitive, and defensive. Supergirl's withdrawal from the center does not resolve tension, it redistributes it. The space she once occupied does not empty quietly. It creates absence. That absence demands explanation. Public discourse fills the gap. Interpretations multiply. Some frame her distance as abandonment, others as maturity. The same act is read through incompatible lenses. This divergence is not confusion, it is polarization. The figure of Supergirl becomes a contested symbol through which broader anxieties are negotiated. Her strength, once reassuring, now destabilizes precisely because it refuses to remain purely instrumental. She does not break the city's laws. She exposes their limits. The discomfort this generates reveals how much the system relied on her silence. Her earlier compliance had allowed the city to imagine itself as benevolent, balanced, and in control. Her refusal to perform gratitude interrupts that self-image. This interruption carries cultural weight. It challenges the myth of the grateful protector, the idea that power gifted from elsewhere should arrive already aligned with local norms. Supergirl's alienation makes visible a dynamic often concealed in heroic narratives, that belonging is frequently conditional, granted only when difference remains manageable. The symbolic terrain shifts accordingly. Strength is no longer neutral. It becomes politicized. Debates emerge not about capability, but about legitimacy. Who has the right to act decisively? Under what conditions? According to whose standards? These questions reverberate beyond the fiction, echoing real-world tensions around authority, intervention, and moral ownership. Within the heroic community itself, her position produces quiet fracture. Other figures begin to recognize their own containment within similar structures. Some adapt further, others distance themselves from her example. Supergirl becomes a reference point, not because she seeks leadership, but because her trajectory reveals possible futures. This is how myth operates at scale. Not through instruction, but through resonance. Her story does not tell audiences what to think. It forces them to notice patterns they already inhabit. The figure who cannot fully belong becomes a mirror for those who experience inclusion as transaction rather than acceptance. Media environments amplify this effect. The constant circulation of her image strips context while intensifying effect. Each appearance is isolated, interpreted, reassembled. Complexity collapses into headline. Narrative coherence fractures into fragments that reinforce pre-existing positions. The medium does not distort the conflict, it accelerates it. In this accelerated space, Supergirl becomes simultaneously hyper-visible and poorly understood. Her silence is filled by projection. Her distance is read as arrogance or rejection. Few consider that withdrawal might be the only remaining form of integrity available within the system she inhabits. Culturally, this produces a familiar dynamic. The figure who refuses to conform becomes suspect. The system frames non-alignment as instability. The burden shifts from structure to individual. Supergirl is discussed as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be examined. Yet the symbolic effect persists. Her presence continues to unsettle. She does not disappear. She intervenes when necessary. She remains close enough to matter. This proximity without compliance frustrates the desire for closure. The system cannot fully expel her, nor can it fully absorb her. This unresolved tension becomes the core of her cultural significance. Supergirl embodies the cost of strength when it exceeds the narrative designed to contain it. She represents power that remembers loss, power that does not arrive empty, power that refuses to forget what was destroyed in order to make the present comfortable. Audiences respond to this unevenly. Some identify with her restraint, others with her refusal. Some see heroism redefined through boundaries rather than sacrifice. Others mourn the loss of reassurance her earlier compliance provided. These responses reflect deeper divisions about how power should operate in a fragile world. Symbolically, her story marks a transition. The heroic figure is no longer expected to resolve contradiction. She is allowed to embody it. The myth shifts from salvation to tension, from closure to permanence. Supergirl does not heal the system. She exposes it. This exposure carries ethical weight. It challenges the assumption that goodness must always be agreeable, that protection must always be gentle, that strength must always be grateful. Her narrative insists that survival can produce urgency, that loss can shape decisiveness, that memory can justify refusal. The cultural impact extends beyond her alone. It reframes the category she occupies. Alien no longer means outsider alone. It signifies a perspective shaped by collapse rather than continuity. Supergirl's alienation becomes a lens through which audiences reconsider who defines normalcy and at what cost. The symbolic meaning of her orbit solidifies. She circles the city like a satellite that refuses re-entry, close enough to affect tides, distant enough to avoid assimilation. This image resonates because it reflects a modern anxiety about participation without surrender, about engagement without erasure. Her story does not offer comfort. It offers clarity. It reveals that systems built on idealization struggle when confronted with lived complexity. That gratitude can become a mechanism of control. That strength, when paired with memory, resists simplification. The conflict has fully exceeded its narrative origin. It now operates as a cultural pattern, repeating across interpretations, adaptations, and audiences. Supergirl remains at its center, not as solution, but as signal. What remains after the conflict is not resolution, but structure. The system does not collapse. The city does not fall. Supergirl does not vanish. Instead, a new configuration settles into place, quieter but more rigid. The lines are clearer now. The center knows where it stands. The periphery knows it is permanent. Supergirl's legacy is defined less by what she changed and more by what she refused to continue carrying. The burden of gratitude, once assumed to be inseparable from her strength, no longer governs her position. This refusal does not dismantle expectation, but it exposes its function. Gratitude is revealed as a mechanism that disguised dependency as generosity. In the aftermath, her role stabilizes into something paradoxical. She remains essential, yet no longer central. She intervenes, but selectively. She protects, but without constant visibility. Her actions are rarer, more decisive, less explanatory. Each appearance carries weight precisely because it is no longer routine. The city adapts. Systems always do. New protocols emerge. Other figures step forward. The absence she leaves at the center is filled, not by replacement, but by diffusion. Responsibility spreads. Authority fragments. This diffusion is framed as progress, but it also dilutes accountability. The clarity her presence once enforced fades. Symbolically, her distance becomes instructive. It marks a boundary that did not previously exist. A limit to what strength can be asked to absorb without distortion. The myth of infinite endurance weakens, not because it is disproven, but because it is no longer embodied without resistance. Her internal world reflects this shift. The coherence she regained through withdrawal persists. She is no longer split between instinct and permission. The alignment between memory and action holds. This alignment comes at the cost of belonging, but it restores authorship over her own force. There is no celebration of this outcome, no narrative triumph. The tone is quieter, heavier. Supergirl exists in a state of sustained tension. She has not escaped the system. She has repositioned herself in relation to it. Orbit replaces integration. Distance replaces compliance. This position carries loneliness, but not confusion. She understands the terrain now. The city is no longer idealized. Its expectations are legible. Its limitations accepted. She does not seek to reform it from within. She no longer needs its approval to justify her presence. Culturally, this legacy endures because it refuses catharsis. Supergirl does not reconcile with the system. The system does not apologize. The discomfort remains intact. This permanence is what grants the narrative its durability. It mirrors a broader cultural condition where power and ethics no longer align cleanly. Her story settles into the collective imagination as a counter-myth. Not the figure who saves through endless sacrifice, but the one who saves by refusing erasure. Not the hero who embodies consensus, but the one who exposes its cost. This distinction matters because it reframes what strength can mean in a complex world. The image that persists is not of ascent or departure, but of sustained suspension. Supergirl in motion, but not advancing toward closure. Present, but not possessed. Her silhouette against the sky becomes a reminder that protection does not require surrender of self. The aftermath is not peace. It is clarity. The city continues to function. Threats continue to emerge. Supergirl continues to respond. But the terms have changed. The exchange is no longer invisible. Every intervention now carries the memory of refusal. This memory shapes future interpretations. Each retelling emphasizes different facets, but the core remains. Strength paired with memory resists simplification. Gratitude demanded as obligation corrodes legitimacy. Systems that rely on idealization struggle when confronted with lived consequence. Her legacy does not instruct. It lingers. It operates as a pressure within the mythology itself, preventing full return to innocence. The world cannot unsee what her trajectory revealed. Even when her presence fades from the center of attention, its imprint remains. Supergirl stands as a figure who survived collapse, entered order, and chose distance over distortion. Not because distance was safer, but because it was truer. Her conflict does not end. It stabilizes into form. The sky remains open. The city remains intact. The weight remains visible.